Ladies and gentlemen, welcome the moderator of the session, Anett Numa.
So good morning, afternoon to everybody who has joined us here, either in the room or also through our virtual channels from all across the world, hopefully. I'm very, extremely happy to be back here in Bratislava in Slovakia for another GLOBSEC event, and even more grateful to be moderating this panel on big tech and European regulations here. So my name is Anett Numa, and I work as a digital transformation advisor at the e-Estonia Briefing Center, but I'm going to be moderating this entire panel today here. So when we talk about Europe-wide innovation ecosystems, there is a clear need to find ways how EU companies could compete against global rivals in a way. That is why it is also very important to elaborate the areas where to invest in, and if we want to boost the tech capabilities in a way, we have to think about what could be the best areas on that side. But however, besides that, the European Union has been coming up with new regulations such as DSA or DMA that raises a question whether EU, by regulating big tech companies, is actually setting global standards for the rest of the world, or at the same time, there could be a question, are we actually stopping innovation here? So we're going to elaborate on different topics today. What are the next steps we need to take to design and establish functional and, of course, also forward-thinking systems of regulating tech heavyweights and of course, ensures competitive market in democratical norms here. But I'm more delighted now to, of course, also introduce you our wonderful speakers, panelists today, who sadly, as you can see, are not joining with me here on the stage in a way, but are joining with me from different places all around the world. So the first person I have a honor to introduce is Olivier Guersent. And Olivier is the Director General of Directorate General for Competition and working in the EU Commission in Brussels. And he has already joined, by the way, European Commission in the year of 1992, very long time ago, and in the Merger Task Force in Directorate General for Competition. So Olivier, thank you for joining us today. And secondly, we do have someone joining us from New York City, very far away. So good morning to you, Anu as well. Anu Bradford, who is the Henry L. Moses Professor of Law, International Organizations, Columbia Law School from New York City, as I said before. And she's also Director for Columbia's European Legal Studies Central. And by the way, she's also the author of a book called The Brussels Effect, How the European Union's Rules the World, which is, by the way, also named as one of the best books of 2020 by the Foreign Affairs. And as a last person, we have together with me here on a panel, Hendrik, who is joining us also from Brussels, if I'm correct. He is the head of the Government Affairs, Europe and Russia, representing Apple, and he is representing Apple's interests with governments and public stakeholders on a wide number of issues, and of course also promoting Apple's growth investments in these regions. And he is the former president also of the American Chamber of Commerce to the European Union here. But before I'm going to start with my questions here, there is also a couple of housekeeping rules. So people who have joined me here in this room, you have also a chance to ask your own questions. There is a microphone right over here where you can just stand up and stop me in a way and raise your hand that you have a question, and then we can take your questions. There is another opportunity also that you can send us questions through the GLOBSEC app, and we use Slido for that. And then the third and last option to submit your questions and talk to our experts today is to also connect over the Zoom application through the virtual studio as well. But now, not to waste any more time on just the introduction side here, let's go for the first question here. So there is a clear willingness and wide political support in the European Union to come up with the highest and most outstanding standards when we talk about tech regulations. The EU has introduced also, as brought out in the beginning, the Digital Service Act and of course also the Digital Market Act in a way. So to start with, what are the three most essential problems these regulations are able to solve? And I would actually start with Olivier, so all the way for you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite. Well, the two. So we have two texts, as you just said. And one is about keeping a market fair, open, competitive, and prone to innovation. That is the Digital Market Act. Because, you know, the accelerating digitalization of society and the economy has created a situation where a few very large platforms control very important ecosystems, and they can deploy what we call network effects very, very quickly. So they have emerged as gatekeepers, as we call them, which means that they control the access of their markets, but also neighboring and adjacent markets by their competitors. So in a word, they can act as private rule makers. And of course, that's not good. That's not good for innovation in particular. So that's the first set of prohibitions, and that mainly the Digital Market Act. Now, the Digital Services Act is everything that is not, strictly speaking, competition. Of course, it's linked to competition, but it's not competition. It's trade and exchange of illegal goods, services and content online, is the misuse of services online by manipulative algorithmic systems to amplify the spread of disinformation, etc. So a number of new challenges and the way platforms should address them with an effort to responsibilize the platforms so that they actually are key into having a safer, better internet. And of course, an additional challenge is to keep regulations flexible, that keeps innovation going, and is future-proof in order to create a stable and predictable regulatory environment that is necessary for firms.
So thank you for the overview, and the same question actually I would ask from Manu. So from all the way to New York right now, what are the problems that we're solving by implementing these regulations?
So thank you, Anett, and delighted to be here. So I think I completely agree with how Olivier described the core of these proposals. But maybe just to elaborate that there are a couple of existing problems that we have had in enforcing regulations in the EU against these tech companies. And these new proposed regulations are meant to resolve them. So first problem is that these investigations that the Commission has taken to date against companies such as Google, they take a long time, and the markets are moving very fast. So here we are giving new tools to the EU regulators to ex ante intervene with a more regulatory approach. So the idea is that we can be much more effective in targeting these problems before they really get entrenched in the marketplace so that they're very hard to reverse. So that's one thing. The second problem that we have dealt with is that often regulation targets differently large companies and small companies in terms of their effect. So something that might be very feasible for a large tech company to comply with can be very burdensome for small and medium-sized companies. That was one of the criticisms of the General Data Protection Regulation, that in many ways it was only entrenching the power of big tech because they were the companies that were able to afford to comply. So now with the DSA and the DMA, the regulatory approach is distinctly asymmetrical, meaning we are giving more burdensome obligations to companies that are able to comply with them and that also have a greater impact in the marketplace.
Thank you for your response as well here. Hendrik, do you want to add something as well?
Look, I think both Anu and Olivier have been correct and clear in their explanations of what both the DSA and the DMA are trying to solve in terms of problems from a technical perspective. One thing that I would add is it's clear that the European Commission believes that there's a market access problem that needs to be solved in digital markets, and that large platform owners are creating bottlenecks for smaller digital firms to access the marketplace. They are quote-unquote gatekeepers. I think that this may be true to a certain extent for certain gatekeepers, for certain operators of digital platforms. For others, I find it more difficult to to see as a real problem. If you take the example of the company that I work for, Apple, we operate a large platform called the App Store. We have 1.8 million apps on the App Store. And part of our business model is to ensure that we have as many as quality apps that are safe, secure, and privacy centric applications on our App Store, because it will make our devices more successful and we'll have better consumer experience and richer experience if we have more apps. So, for some of those objectives, the problems from my perspective, certainly for a company perspective, Apple, are less realistic. And then what I would also add, if I can, I think also there's an underlying political problem that Europe is trying to address, which is by setting the global standard, the ambition of setting the global standard for platform regulation. I think Europe wants to try to contribute to achieving greater digital sovereignty. Because if it is able to set the global standard, it means that others will have to comply with that standard, and that therefore European values that are included in those European regulations will be decided in Europe, and so decisions will be not taken outside of Europe. So I think there's this underlying political objective as well.
Yeah. We're going to come back to that, whether the rest of the world is going to be taking over the regulations by the European Union as well a little later. But I would actually continue with you, Hendrik, here, because I have a question especially regarding you're representing Apple here. So we know that the big tech companies face yearly checks on how they are tackling illegal content under the new rules by the European Commission in a way. And different kind of large fines and breakups are threatening in case big tech companies are non-compliance. And in case of companies refuse to buy, they could have to hand over up to 10% of their turnover. As a representative of Apple, Hendrik, could you evaluate the impressiveness of these measures?
Well, let me start by saying that, of course, fines and remedies, whether they're structural or behavioral remedies, are, of course, very important factors that will contribute without a doubt to achieving the stated goals of those regulations. But they're not novel features. I mean, competition law today allows for the ability to impose fines, to impose these types of remedies, privacy legislation as well to a lesser extent, but you still have enforcement mechanisms. And so the DSA and the DMA in particular also have enforcement mechanisms and fines, which is not very novel. What I think the real novelty lies in the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, which proposes an ex-ante approach. It basically stands for the proposition that certain conduct by platforms is illegal, and it creates basically a shortcut for public authorities to decide which one should be allowed and which one shouldn't be allowed. I mean, the traditional approach is that one should first determine that a company has significant market power, that it has durable market power or dominance that allows it to, operate to a significant extent independently from its consumers and customers. Public authorities won't have to do that anymore under the DMA. Secondly, there won't be a need to determine whether or not the conduct in question constitutes, or risks excluding competitors, or abusing consumers or exploiting consumers. That's, a given, that's predetermined. And last but not least, it certainly does not require the public authorities to determine whether there are countervailing justifications or efficiencies, economic efficiencies or non-economic efficiencies that would warrant, in specific cases, not imposing specific obligations. And so that's really the novelty, and it really stands for the proposition, Anett, that legislators, because it's now in the hands of the legislators, that legislators have gained sufficient knowledge, sufficient experience in these complex, diverse, and very dynamic markets that they can actually, in advance, codify which behavior is appropriate, which behavior is not appropriate. And I find that, a difficult working hypothesis. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. But speaking from the citizens' perspective here, a survey released in the year of 2019 stated that 74% of the European citizens would want to know more how their data is used by social media platforms when they access other websites. Concerns over the data and its protection has grown drastically in recent years. That's what we all know here. How has the European Commission addressed these trends? And I would ask this question from Olivier.
Well, thank you. Well, let me first maybe react to what Hendrik just said, so that will make it a bit more fun. I mean, it just describes the difference between competition law and regulatory policy. I mean, there's the very essence of an ex-ante regulation, in particular in consumer protection field or fair trading, is that you tell companies what they cannot do. And in this case, what they cannot do is actually, that's why there is a relatively limited list of things they cannot do, and it's based on 20 years of decision practice of the Commission and case laws of the cases in court. So these are practices from which we know that when they are implemented by large platforms with a gatekeeper function, are invariably detrimental to consumers. So from the point of view of citizens, that is quite relevant. For the rest, there is a common understanding around the world that there is a need for balanced regulation that ensures that citizens and business can benefit equally from the opportunities offered by the digital economy. And we did not yet address the draft bills that are now in front of the US Congress. Because to borrow the words of Hendrik, I guess the Congress also felt confident enough to be able to table quite far-reaching proposal, and in some ways more far-reaching than what we have proposed here in Europe. The protection of users' privacy, for example, is key principle. It has guided action over the past years in the GDPR, and it is true that to a large extent for the GDPR we have set a global standard, but that's not the objective. Our objective is not to rule the world. Maybe others have this objective, but that's not ours. Our objective is to protect our citizens and have a legal system which offers the digital ecosystems the opportunity to grow, innovate, while respecting European value. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to complement the existing framework, data protection laws. For example, transparency obligations on deep consumer profiling will help inform GDPR enforcement, whereas mandatory opt-out for data combination across core platform services supplements the existing level of protection under the GDPR. So you have a lot of cross relationship which are here to actually address very deep concerns, as your poll showed, within EU citizens.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up also the comparison regarding the GDPR regulations as well, because we know that thanks to GDPR regulations, which was already introduced in the year 2018, the EU citizens had a stronger right to decide what big tech companies can do with their information and personal data, and this also inspired by many other lawmakers from all across the world to make changes in their systems as well. We have a couple of examples regarding from Brazil, from Australia, and this also has raised stronger discussions on data protection in the US. And as Anu, you are based in New York City, do you think that the same effect would also happen this time with the DSA and the DMA regulations as well, that different lawmakers from other countries are going to make some changes in their systems too?
Yeah, so let's just be clear on how the EU has been so effective in making the GDPR the global standard. And I agree with Olivier that it is not for the intention to rule the world. The EU has been very confident in laying out a regulatory approach that serves the European citizens and internet users. And at the same time, when doing so, when it has been regulating the companies and their privacy standards, these companies have made a voluntary decision in line with their business interests, often to extend the European rule across their global practices. So in that sense, only by regulating the single market, the EU has been able to sit back and let the companies then transpose the European standard across the global marketplace. So that's why Apple has the European GDPR as its global privacy standard. The same goes for Google, Facebook, Microsoft. So whether this would then happen in the DMA and DSA context, I would say that there are many reasons why I would expect at least partial Brussels effect to touch these regulations as well. First of all, the world in which the EU is now introducing these regulations has shifted already towards the European norms. So compared to the time when the GDPR was released, I think there was less of a refined understanding around the world how much these companies' business models depend on data, often very privacy-infringing ways of gaining access to data, tracking the consumers online, and compromising in many ways the personal autonomy and privacy of the individuals. So there's a lot more willingness to focus on what the EU is doing, with the understanding that the EU is often the trailblazer and the one with the most ambitious standard, and with the capacity then to often set the standards globally. So I think the companies are watching what the EU is doing, also considering when it is in their interest to implement any of the changes caused by the DMA and DSA across the global marketplace. But then we also have foreign governments who are increasingly responding to the demand of their citizens to also offer a more robust regulatory framework. So I think we will see this at two levels. We will see some of these practices by the corporations, big tech companies, to be implemented globally. There will be more accountability, more algorithmic transparency, but we will also see the governments in different parts of the world, including in the United States. The conversation is really shifting in the US when it comes to the harms of the big tech and the need for the regulators to be more interventionist. So I also see much more demand on the US side to start following the European regulatory approach.
And thank you, Anu. Now switching over to a topic of regulating AI, which was also one of the topics of our conversation here today. We know that the European Commission is also working on a plan of regulating the use of AI. More and more tech companies and also some of the states also, where I come from, Estonia, is using AI solutions, AI-based solutions, technology already for quite some time for offering services to the customers and also the citizens aspect. Do you think that the new rules in regulating the use of AI are some ways stopping the innovation, and most of these regulations are not even being fully approved yet? Aren't we a little bit too late already by regulating the use of AI in some of the places? Maybe the question could be for Olivier.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, too early or too late, it's always the problem of every regulator. Too early, you stifle innovation. Too late, damage might have happened. So that's always an issue. But the reason why we're putting rules in place for new technologies is to tackle any concerns, but also in terms of business opportunities, mistrust that people might have. And once the mistrust is there, it becomes very difficult to regain the confidence of the consumers. So it's also good for people. That's my message. And we want also to give clarity and predictability to all involved, and in particular companies. So AI is no doubt a strategic technology. It involves tremendous opportunities, but some of its uses pose very specific risks that relate to the application of various EU rules designed to ensure safety, designed to protect fundamental rights and value. So with this initiatives, what we want to do is try to ensure that AI is developed and used in a legal framework with the overall goal to stimulate the take-up of trustworthy AI in our single market. So concretely, the proposal proposes limited or no regulation for AI systems when they pose minimal or no risk. And that is the case for the overwhelming majority. But the proposal bans systems that pose unacceptable risks. For example, toys using voice assistants that encourage dangerous behavior of minors, or systems that allow social scoring by governments. This will be banned in the EU. And we also plan to impose strict requirements on systems that pose a high risk. Let me just take an example. AI application in robot-assisted surgery. Well, I think we have a duty to impose extra safety on this type of application. So, of course, there is more than one way to get the balance right, but this is really about getting the balance right between building trust and increasing uptake on the one hand, versus fostering innovation on the other hand. And we believe we struck the best balance we could.
But Oliver, a follow-up question to you as well here is that do you think that we should raise awareness of AI in the European Union in a way? Because we have had these discussions a lot because people mistake the AI still like even in the year 2021. So do you think we should have any kind of, I don't know, projects or initiatives again to raise the public awareness of the AI?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think people have a pretty good idea what AI is. I'm not sure how successful an awareness-raising campaign would be. I mean, I think generally what the average citizen wants to benefit from all the increased wealth and choice and quality of new services that it involves, but it doesn't want this privacy to be at stake, or at least not in a way that is sort of kind of involuntary. And it certainly wants that applications that are life-risking or potentially go against core criminal regulations are either banned or strictly controlled. I think this is the debate we must have, rather than a generic debate on what AI is.
Thank you. We have already received a couple of questions also from our audience, and I would encourage everyone, you have a chance to ask questions, or if anybody here in the room wants to ask a question, raise your hand. You'll be welcome to join us here. So one of the questions that is kind of interesting that we have received from someone from our listeners today. When and why the European Union wants to regulate mobile phone manufacturers to implement one common USB charger cable for every brand? Who wants to go and answer that? Oliver, you? Hendrik?
Well, I have no idea. I just to recall, I'm Director General for Competition, but I'm happy to ask my colleague in charge of standardization.
Hendrik, any comments from that?
No, I think there have been calls in the European Union for regulating the so-called common chargers for mobile devices. I'm not aware of what the latest status is of those initiatives. I would just add that I think that it's an important role for policymakers and legislators is to set out what the objectives ought to be for manufacturers in terms of achieving environmental standards, environmental footprints. But I would caution against politicians and regulators and legislators to decide which specific technology manufacturers should be using in the marketplace. I think these are decisions that are better left to engineers and market participants. But again, frankly, I'm not sure what the current status is of the proposal. I know that there are people that are thinking about introducing these types of proposals. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So there is another question from our one of our listeners in a way. So will the newly created standards contractual clauses be a sufficient tool for comply with the conclusions of Schrems 2? Who would like to take that one here? Any comments from Anu, Oliver?
Well, I don't know. I talked a lot, so maybe Anu, and then I'm happy to compliment if you want.
I am happy to weigh in. And just to remind of the listeners who may not be familiar with the ins and outs of the history of the data transfers between the United States and the EU, is that there has been a specific agreement negotiated by the US and the EU government to facilitate the data flows and to respond to the concerns that the Europeans have, that the Americans don't sufficiently guarantee the protection of the privacy of the European data. But these agreements negotiated have been invalidated not just once, but twice by the highest European court. So we have a tremendous pressure to find a way to restore those data flows that are fundamentally important for both the United States and the European economy. But I would be too quick to try to conclude that now something is sufficient, because the history shows that the European Court will hold these agreements to an extremely high standard. But what we do see that there is a political agreement, both in the US and the EU, that something needs to be done. The negotiations have been accelerated, and there's a genuine attempt to find a solution that both serves the dire business needs, but also take seriously the fundamental rights protections. Nobody wants a third case from the European Court of Justice that yet again will invalidate those data flows. There's enough legal uncertainty, but I am optimistic that given the importance of these issues, it will be elevated in salience and priority.
Thank you, Anu. So moving over here, so it has been discussed very widely why most of the global tech giants have not chosen European Union or EU as their home market. Has it anything to do with regulations, or what's the reason why the very big tech companies have not chosen the European Union as their home in a way? Maybe Hendrik, you would like to take that one.
Sure. So I don't think regulation is a key factor as to why there are virtually no successful global tech players that are of European origin. I mean, it probably plays a role, but frankly, you know, the reality is that today digital technology is changing our lives, it's changing our society. And so let me be very clear. I think it's totally legitimate and appropriate and necessary for policymakers, regulators, legislators to make sure that that they have the right tools, instruments that are fit for purpose to ensure that their citizens and their companies can leverage the opportunities of digital technologies and protect them from the risk that sometimes derives from digital technology. So there's, as such and of itself, I think nothing inappropriate or abnormal, on the contrary, to wanting to make sure that there's regulation in place. The difficulty is making sure that the regulation is the right regulation, that's appropriate regulation. And I think if you want to, you know, export regulation as a rule maker, you want to make sure that it does protect consumer, it does protect privacy rights, and the DMA in this respect, I think, is open to criticism as it's being proposed. Having said that, what makes companies decide to you know, invest in a specific country to become a global player, I think these are you know, very critical questions, and you know, I can think of a number one. Number one is access to venture capital, and in order to have access to venture capital, you have to have very well functioning capital markets. I think the European Union needs to work on that. Secondly, investment. Europe is working on investment. We have an unprecedented 750 billion recovery plan. 20% of it, 30% of it is dedicated to digital, which is great. Thirdly, digital skills. There's a huge digital skills gaps that Europe can address. And last but not least, I think Europe needs to continue to working on the digital single market. And this is where regulation can play a very positive role in eliminating barriers to trade and investment that exist as a result of different legal regimes in Europe. And so in a way, regulation can help innovation, can help also ensuring that digital players in Europe become more successful on a global basis.
Also, I would follow up the same question to Oliver. How to get very big tech companies to set up their headquarters to Europe? How do you attract like the big companies?
To me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I agree entirely with what Hendrik has said. And it's not a question of attracting, really. I mean, you know, people tend to establish where they're from. So if you're Steve Jobs, why on earth would you incorporate Apple in the EU? Well, you're very fine in California, and you have everything you need. You have indeed the capital markets, you have the skills, you have the working capital, you have everything you need. So the question for the EU is how do you create the conditions that make that the next Apple will be European. And it's not so much a question of innovation, because we do have innovation. But the problem is that when these innovators need to move to the higher scale, they do not find the financing. So risk capital, venture capital, and that's why we have launched this capital market union project in Europe that didn't go fast enough, and is still not going fast enough. It is because when the companies, these innovators, needs to reach the capital mass to become true world players, well, they usually cross the Atlantic because this is where they get finance. I mean, Moderna, take vaccines. Moderna is a great success story of the US, except it's a bunch of Marseille, France-based scientists. But when they needed 5 billion, the only place on earth where they could find it was in the US, so they moved to the US. Very good for the US, very bad for us. Spotify. And you would have many other success stories like this. And this is because at some point you need to go where you find the capital to finance you. Skills, of course, very important as well, and all the other factors that Hendrik mentioned. Regulation, in my view, definitely not a deterrent. When really well used, actually an attractivity factor, in my view.
Thank you. We have received a question from Lucia on our app and in Slido. So will the EU and US, with all the strong regulations, be able to compete with global powers such as China, given the fact and disclosure that data is the new oil? Anu?
Maybe the words and
say that, you know, but
sorry?
Do you want to go, Olivier? Okay, I'm happy to take that, but I just want to mention the earlier conversation by Olivier and Hendrik was fundamentally important. So if I can just add one more dimension to that, because this idea that we always pitting regulation as being, can it be an enabler for innovation, or is it really an enemy of innovation? I think it can be a very harmful conversation. So I just want to reinforce the important message that Hendrik and Olivier were saying of the importance of understanding that if we can, through regulation, create a more robust and harmonized digital single market, we have a very different foundation for innovation. But what we do need is an integrated capital markets. You need to be able to raise the funds to grow those innovations. And that is absolutely a key. And then to pick up on one thing, and I think it feeds a little bit to the next question as well, Olivier said the innovators normally establish where they come from. But think about, where do these big tech executive giants come from? So if you think about Steve Jobs, is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos is a second-generation Cuban. Sergey Brin is from Russia. Elon Musk is from South Africa. It is not all homegrown talent in the United States. So Europe also needs to be the magnet for talent and the destination that attracts the best minds and innovators. And I would use that as a segue to this great question that we got from the audience, is that who wins these races is where that innovation, where the best minds want to migrate to and want to innovate. And in many ways, America has been the place that has generated the ecosystem, the universities, the capital markets, the being welcoming of migrants. That many ways, the EU needs to replicate those, first of all. But then to be able to compete against China, I think there was a wonderful line at some point when the EU got some pressure, the Commission from France and Germany, that we would need to turn towards industrial policy to better compete with China. And Commissioner Vestager said that, look, let the Chinese be Chinese. We would be lousy Chinese. They are much better at it. And ultimately, that would be the most dangerous path for the EU to take, is to choose protectionism, build a fortress Europe, turn this idea of digital sovereignty that Hendrik was talked about to this kind of instrument of protectionism. That will not be a path to victory. But the EU needs to assert itself true to its values, because it is really offering a different path than China is. Absolutely disrespectful of the fundamental rights of individual users. And that is the price of the Chinese model. And the Europeans cannot and should not and will not replicate that. And in many ways, even Americans in this race are second guessing now these kind of techno-libertarian foundations of American success, and are understanding that ultimately regulation needs to be part of that. So in many ways, I think the EU is on the right track with the values underlying the European model of the digital economy, if it remains mindful of some of these other issues like the capital markets completing the digital single market. I'm sorry it was a lengthy answer, but the question was just very important, I thought, so thank you for that.
Thank you for a very insightful answer here too. Oliver, you want to add something as well? No? Can we move to next?
I said it all, including the quotation of Margrethe Vestager. So.
All right. We also have received another question from the audience by Romana, who has asked that how the Digital Services Act package may affect the future. Do you think that this could eliminate some internet threats as well?
Well,
Maybe
that's the goal.
Yeah. Oliver,
Hendrik, maybe.
No, I mean, it goes without saying, this is the objective. The goal of the DSA is to increase responsibility for digital players as to the content that they put online. It increased also legal certainty for digital players to ensure that the digital single market works well. And I'm sure that there's a number of very important guiding principles in the proposed DSA that will form a blueprint for other jurisdictions, other countries around the world to follow it. That goes without saying. And, you know, I can just add that, you know, from my perspective, working for Apple, you know, this is something that we're very familiar with because we have a curated approach towards putting content online. We have, you know, actual human beings that vet third-party applications before we put them online to make sure that they are legal, safe, secure, and don't infringe on the privacy rights of our users. So I'm hopeful that it will. I think, you know, it's certainly, you know, nothing is ever perfect in any proposal, and so there's always room for improvement. But generally speaking, I'm convinced that it would make a change. And by the way, if I can pick up on the previous question, I also think this is something that is being looked at in the United States. And I therefore think that some type of transatlantic cooperation on these issues is of extreme importance, because the United States and Europe do share a lot of values that perhaps other regions of the world do not share to the same extent. And so, you know, if we want to be successful, in promoting, protecting the prosperity of our citizens, I think the Europeans, but also the Americans, will be much better off if they work together in establishing these principles and the rules that will flow from those principles.
Absolutely, fully agree with you on the last point regarding transatlantic also collaboration. As we just have 1.5 minutes left here, so as the very last concluding point here, a question to everybody, and I would ask a very short answer for that. So is the European approach, is it visionary or is it killing helpful innovation? Let's start from Manu and just with the one sentence as a conclusion.
I think I was pretty lengthy in my earlier answer that it is both visionary and it is not killing innovation, but there are still components that need to be put in place in order to translate that vision into tangible full success. So I would call for more ambition and more integrated capital markets, more foreign talent, and maybe that's a good one to start.
Olivier, your last notes.
Yeah, very same as Anu. I will add more cooperation between universities and business. I mean, it's really not the core that is, or the vision that is at stake. It's all the ecosystem, and it's something that you build through small steps here and there that makes that. I mean, innovation takes place in a region or it doesn't. company grow in that region or they do not. It's many things, and it has to do with capital, it has to do with skills, it has to do with everything that makes a successful company. And the regulation is there as an enabler, but if you don't have the rest, it doesn't work.
And closing remarks from Hendrik.
I don't think it's, I think it would be overstating that it's visionary. I think, Europe is doing what it's legitimately and should be doing, which is to, protect and promote the interests and the prosperity of its citizens. I would call that visionary. I don't think that the regulation will kill innovation. I agree with Olivier, but there are aspects in the proposals that would reduce trust in the system, that will reduce privacy protections, that would reduce safety and security. And you need trust to innovate. If people stop having trust in ecosystems, people will be more reluctant to try new features, to download new apps. And so I think, it's very important that legislators today, and I'm crossing my fingers that they will, internalize that the proposals are not perfect and that there's room for improvement to maintain that trust, to promote and encourage further innovation.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the panelists, and thanks for people that has joined us here in the room and also virtually. So I do hope that was interesting panel for you to listen to, and then there is definitely some improvement made by making this entire approach more visionary and attracting more companies to start their business here in Europe. But now for information as well here, so coming up in the next 5 minutes here in the same room, we have a session called Climate Change and Global Security, a closer relationship than one might think. And then in another room, in Maria Theresa stage, there is a session, Cities in Lockdown, with representatives of the cities of Bratislava, Budapest, and Prague. So thank you from my side, and I wish you a very nice day.
Thank you.